Pleasure to introduce Althea Sumpter, our speaker for today. She is a friend of mine from a long time, since I was in women's studies at Georgia State and met her through Linda Bell. She is a writer, a researcher. She is a member of our writers group, and we are so fortunate to be able to hear her essays and letters and chapters from her book, and anything else that she writes are so full of wisdom. She is our tech guru and gets us on Zoom when we have difficulties being challenged by that, many of us. She gives workshops on how to research your own family and ancestors and connect them with the cultural community at large. She is currently writing a book based on interviews, oral histories of elders in the Gullah Geechee culture from which she comes. And this is an incredibly fascinating work, which I have been fortunate enough to hear part of. So I'm just so happy to introduce Althea Sumpter.
I'm laughing because I never know how Charlene is going to introduce me. I told her, leave it up to you. Now you know enough about me, and so thank you. And once again I'm here at First E, and it's I hear people. I hear you talking about which march you were on and, where you were and such. I'll have you know that I was sitting at home drinking tea. As a black woman, that's what many of us are doing now. Because I want to see white faces out there this time. Yeah. And somebody contacted me yesterday and asked me that same question and says, how come I didn't see as many black people? And I was like, because you've got to step up now. Yeah. And I kept thinking about that. So many people are always asking, black women black women's going to be black women, this and that. And I say that there are only 4, maybe 5% of us eligible voters in this country. How are we going to do anything without white faces, white people, white allies? Absolutely. And so I was glad to be sitting at home watching TV, watching y'all do the work this time. Not to say that there haven't been allies out there as well, laying your bodies down with the rest of us. And so this is when I was asked to speak today with, and it's being Father's Day. And I kept thinking, it's like, okay, my writing group know a lot about me and the kind of struggles, issues, topics I deal with, and so this time I said that, there's this one thing that I need to talk about, and it's about my father, and that's what I'll share with you, and it's one of those things where it had me reflect back on my childhood. And I do a lot of writing in my journal, and it calms me, and it calms my soul. And I, not that I'm so special that, somebody's going to eventually read anything that I write, but the thing is that I am able to look back in my journal and reflect And it occasionally helps me to move forward. It gives me perspective. I mean, there are journal writers out there, I'm sure. But, as a woman of a certain age, I have a lot to reflect on. And one entry in my journal, this always stuck with me. And I shared it with a few people, and each person saw it as psychological abuse and wondered how I endured. And it is about my father, and I had to learn how to reason with this man, this proud man born in 1923 who experienced World War II France. And then when he came back home, as a black man, got married and raised a family of 3 boys and 1 girl during the Jim Crow South. And I am that girl. I'm the youngest. So I'm going to read this journal entry. It was from October 2019. In my early teens, my father would tell me, "You're fat and you're ugly and your hair won't grow. You'll be a whore when you grow up." When I first told my Ohio German husband that story, he was shocked. His first reaction was that it sounded like child abuse. Only recently have I reflected back to that time in the 1960s and wondered in a new way about why my father would say something so hurtful. Hurt that I overcame by defying the way he projected my future and forcing him to show his affection to me by giving his college-bound daughter a hug and a kiss. He would show his affection in public without hesitation. That was a lot for a black man to hug and kiss his child, his daughter, his now teen going off to college as he's putting me on the bus to go off to college. That so-called future whore is strong with a strong power of defiance. I now wonder if somehow calling me such hurtful names was a black father's way of building strength in his black daughter. It could be seen as reverse psychology, but those words really did hurt. My hair did not grow well, despite all of my mother's attempts to fix my hair to grow below my earlobes, using a hot comb and the ever-present kinks at the edges of my hair to fashion it into an acceptable European look. We won't talk about black women and having to do with our hair, just so we can get a job, keep a job, get ahead. I have always had a chunky belly, a physical trait from my father's side of the family. It was his fault, right? We would laugh about who in the family, including aunts, uncles, and cousins, had a Sumpter belly. Despite those physical traits, I've become a woman more distinctive in style and comfort, whose face is a perfect blending of both my parents, while my brothers each resemble one parent or the other. Why would my father call me a whore? I can only speculate that many decades ago, he may have feared that the sexualized image placed upon black female bodies during that era would put his daughter in danger from various directions. His life in the South, beginning in the 1920s, was replete with the lessons of surviving as a black male. Raising a daughter during that era must have frightened him. My mother surely shared his fear. Although she radiated a strength that I grew up emulating, she was always strong, defiant, and opinionated during an onset of social change. My father was always beside her. My parents signed up their children to desegregate the all-white public school system. They always looked after elders in the community, and they would find some last dollar to give a high school graduate making their way to college, sometimes the first child in the family to do so, lugging a trunk onto a bus traveling away from home. But I never became a whore. I have had my own life experiences with no regret, and I have my own treasure trove of survival stories. Some lessons about overcoming trauma conveyed by my parents in their own subtle way. It has taken many decades to gain perspective about my father's way of raising a daughter, the one child they relied on in their elder days before each passed on beyond the veil. I read a recent article which recounted a young black girl calling herself a hoe. Will she carry that with her as an adult woman? Will she learn to forgive those around her who labeled her blackness a social disorder, a sexualized misunderstanding of her present and future self that empowers her to become a defiant black woman? And that's where I ended that journal entry. And I thought beyond that, and just recently, when I was asked to talk about my father, about how this made me feel, and it gave me a chance to, reflect. I mean, my family would have been considered middle class by today's standard. I mean, the same as many blacks in our community who we owned our own land, since Reconstruction era. We were the few within that area that owned and still owned our land. By the mid-'60s, my parents built their own businesses independent of white control. They were community activists and involved in the civil rights movement and were pillars of our community, or some of the pillars of our community. The most dangerous experience was going into town, across the bridge, where the stench of segregation had a hold and Jim Crow laws were still ingrained enough to control the behavior of blacks. We still had to be careful going into town. Didn't matter about 1964, 1965 new laws and such. The hate was still there. The old anxiety of my parents getting into trouble and into trouble with the law, and anything happening to my parents and their children being taken away, that was still present. We still had to obey those now laws that were more social. I do not know what my father was trying to teach me, what fears he harbored for a daughter growing up in the Jim Crow South. But I've learned how to stand firm, to defy those who would not want me to stand as an equal. My mother taught me, and this is a lesson that virtually every black child was taught, is that we had to do twice as much to be considered equal to any white person. I have a doctorate. Did it take that for me to be considered equal? In my adult years, I learned to share fun and joy with my parents. We became really good. We became really tight. I became a success to them. This way that my mother would always talk about me. So everybody in the entire community on the island, really, the island in South Carolina, St. Helena Island, some people may know it, in Beaufort County, that's where I'm from. And I'd go home and they were like, oh, you're doing this and that and the other. I'm like, oh my God. She said, I just want to tell people what you're doing. And so they could depend on me in their older years to the point where I would tease them with their basket names. In our community, basket names. In my culture, it's called basket name, the family name or the nickname. And my father even showed me where he kept his pint, in the corner of the garage. Y'all know about the pint, right? We would go behind you'd sit behind in a place where my mother wouldn't see us, and he would share a cup of hot water. That's what you call it. Yeah, get yourself some hot water. But his favorite scotch. It's like, and he'd pour some, and he'd say, you got to cut it with some water so it don't mess up your stomach. And he passed the cup to me. That was a special time. I earned his respect and his love. And the question for me, for all of that I went through, being called that, now standing at this point in time as a woman of a certain age, having experienced the days before we were equal or considered even, well, in a lot of ways we're still not there. Was there any other way for parents to raise a daughter in the rural South before we became full citizens? Black girls had to learn to become survivors. They might have been told you were ugly so that our hearts could become hardened, and we face the standards of beauty that idolize blonde hair and fair skin. I wonder how many black girls were taught to bear up the same way I was. And I kept thinking about that, and I think this has led me to even open up about this journal entry, because now I want to ask that question of other black women of a certain age who may have even experienced that transition from being a non or not fully citizen to being the desegregation kid, third grade, white people yelling and screaming at me and the busload of folks, and enduring all of that segregation, the changes and such, and the social change. I lived it. It seems to me that too many others expect black women to become their savior, especially during social change of the 1960s, during the civil rights movement. In politics, when we were expected to turn votes into a win for democracy, there are only 4 or 5% of us black women, eligible black women voters. There are only, nowadays, as of 30 years ago, within the last 30 years, there are now only about 13% of the US population who are black. And I grew up, when I was going through in the 50s, 60s, 70s, there are only 9% of us. And as we lived with this thing that you see one black person, white people see 1,000. That's what we were taught so that we could protect ourselves. You see one black person, looks like 1,000 to me. We were also expected to become caretakers for those who were dependent on home care, and in their old age, how many black women are taking care of how many other people? How many black women are being taken care of? So what price must we pay for bearing such a burden? When did black women become protectors, expected to stand on the front lines of change? And I will tell you now that I have accepted and acknowledged that I have PTSD. It has, from the moment as a third grader when the buses rolled in to desegregate, all the way through now, I will never forget the faces. I will never forget that moment. I will never forget from there on how every day I walk out of my house, I've had to learn to put my shields up to protect myself, because you never know where the hate and the hurt is going to come from. I see this black face. That's what we were taught. Make sure when you look at yourself every morning, you see a black face. How many white people go through that? How many white people say, I see a white face every morning? How many white people go through and say, oh, this is a white face? Or unless you say, oh, this is me. No, I am a black woman. I see my face. My name is. So I can never forget. So yeah, that's PTSD, isn't it? So I've learned to dare anyone to treat me as other than a black woman of the South. Yeah, I am a Southerner. I've experienced Jim Crow laws of segregation, and I've lived to see equality and diversity become possible. I say possible. I will be heard. I will not bend. I will be present. I was taught to keep my eyes wide open, must keep watch, just as my father's mother taught. She became a midwife in the community with her bowler hat and her double-hung skirt, and she was known to have chased buckra. That's white man in my culture's language. He chased buckra off her porch with a shotgun. They never bothered my family again, but no matter what, she said, you must keep watch. And she said, keep a look-see. That's what I learned, to keep a look-see. I see the ones who would dare to minimize my life and try taking me back to a time when laws treated me as less than because of my skin color. What does 1950s mean to these people who say we want to go back? 1950s? Maybe my strength comes from where I grew up on the islands of South Carolina, a place where Emancipation Proclamation was first read on January 1st, 1963, the beginning of the annual watch night that took place before. The plan for Reconstruction began in the Beaufort District of South Carolina after the Union military captured the area from the Confederacy in October 1861. 2.5 years later, after that emancipation, word finally reached Brackenville, Texas, to those who were still enslaved. And that was the beginning of Juneteenth. We celebrate that this coming week. So my history is about the people who survived, and my memory is bound to that because of learning how we got over. How in so many ways, lessons passed down from one generation to the next and such. And I've got to say, white people, no, please, when you say people, or when you say, please say who you're talking about, okay? I know we still are, and I still hear this thing where somebody say, well, people. I say, what people? Black, white, brown, what? Who, which? And then say something and it's, well, this is definitely white people. Say, well, okay, white people, stop asking black people how we do it. The books and the lessons have been written and it has been around since a lot of actions and activities since the early 1800s. It's there. Stop asking black people what to do. Read so many people who have done this over and over and over and over and over and over again. So my memory is about my strength, where that strength comes from, because the work of remaining strong is how I honor the generations before me. It's a burden, PTSD. But my father's mother taught me to always look him in the eye. That was what she always said, she look him in the eye. Must keep watch. Must keep a look-see. And why do I tell my story? I feel obligated to write about my black Southern self, my Gullah Geechee culture, my heritage on the islands of South Carolina, my joys and my memories of hurt. I need to tell the stories because I want others to know what I went through, what so many others of us, especially Black women, have gone through. Black and allies endured to make diversity and equality work. My writing could be cathartic, but sharing it with others, like me, is my way to understand we did a good thing. Celebrate that. We have done a good thing. We need to tell our stories in order to counter the bad actions of these political times so that the stress and the disappointments do not take us back, any of us, to a time when certain ugly behavior of segregation was law and acceptable. I still remember Jim Crow laws, that I grew up with as a child. It doesn't go away. But I'm looking. I see. And I will not go back. I will not go back. Thank you.